This program will begin shortly. Please use the hashtag AspenIdeasClimate on social media. Please remember to turn your mobile devices to silent. Please welcome Benji Backer.
Good morning. How are we? We're going to start the morning with some high energy. Happy Tuesday and a happy first full day of the Aspen Institute Climate Festival here in Miami Beach. It's an honor to be the opening speaker, and it's an honor to be here because I think this is one of the most important and influential conferences of the year. We have some of the biggest CEOs and politicians here. We also have some of the world's top young activists here in the audience. I got to speak at the Future Climate Leaders Summit on Saturday. Anybody in this room from the Future Climate Leaders program? You guys are awesome. You guys are really awesome. And the reason that is because it's not the CEOs or the politicians that are here that are actually going to change the course of history on this. They can start laying the groundwork for that. But it's the people who were in their room on Saturday and Sunday and now are here to this conference that are actually going to pave that road for the long run. And it's just an honor to have you guys here too. So I grew up in the Midwest in Wisconsin as a conservative activist. I was a conservative activist my entire life, starting at the age of 10, knocking doors and making phone calls before my voice even changed. And it hasn't changed that much, but you know, we'll deal with that later. And one of the things that really bugged me was the conservative stance on climate change and the environment. I was frustrated by it every time that I went out on a hike with my family, anytime we went to our small cabin on a lake in rural Wisconsin. And when I went to college at the University of Washington, where I solely went because I wanted to go somewhere where I could hike and ski, that was literally the only reason. My parents weren't big fans of that, but that was the reason I went out there. And I started to realize that I wanted to do something about it, to bring conservatives to the table to solve climate change in the environment, which is something I think everyone in this room can get behind. But I had an opinion that I think a lot of people might share in this room that was broken very quickly, which is that I thought that there was this generational divide and political divide on climate change that was almost unbreakable, that conservatives and Republicans, especially in the era of Donald Trump, hated the environment, and that we had to basically create a brand new culture around environmentalism that included young conservatives, but kind of just let the older generations, honestly, die out. Then I started to travel the country to try to meet with conservative communities and actually understand where they were coming from. And I quickly learned something that is an important secret to share, which is that conservatives care about the environment a lot. These are the people that live in these communities that are in the environment. These are the foresters, these are the farmers, these are the people that rely on the environment to survive. They also are the ones that are providing us the resources for us to survive. And yet for years, we vilified those communities and refused to visit them and refused to engage with them to the point where their only option in their minds is to jump to the opposite extreme and to say, to hell with the environmental movement, I'm just against everything they stand for. And because of that growing divide, the solutions have become even worse. You have one side that says that we need a Green New Deal, and the other side says that this issue doesn't exist at all. That divide will never solve climate change. And until we engage the conservative communities, the rural communities, we will never solve climate change. But there's an inherent difference between the way that conservative and rural communities think about climate change and the way that maybe we do as more urban people. I would assume most of us are more urban people. I live in Phoenix now, and I'm sure all of us kind of most of us live in bigger cities or suburban areas. Conservative communities like a few things: a slower pace of life, the importance of community and their local community. They don't like rapid change and radical change. And they don't really care as much about efficiency as we do. They don't care about kind of getting from A to B as quickly as possible and picking up your laundry as you pick up your groceries as you get them all delivered to your door. They don't care as much about that. And so when we make our policies just for the urban community, we leave behind an entire additional subset of the population that is so imperative to this problem. And when I started ACC, I went to an environmental NGO kind of private gathering of CEOs, where one of the top CEOs of one of the more urban environmental organizations told me that I was the first conservative that they had ever met that cared about the environment. And a few months later, I toured a coal plant in Utah, where I was told by the coal workers that I was the first environmentalist they had ever met. That divide is the problem. We are refusing to talk to each other. We are refusing to understand where each other are coming from. We're refusing to move past the days of Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow and the divisive news cycle that we have. We're feeding into it by allowing this to become the most partisan issue of our time when it should be the most unifying issue of our time. So what can climate change activists do to change that? We must stop the one-size-fits-all environmental approach that we've used for years, that pins rural people as the enemy, that pins conservative communities as the enemy. Too often I've been in conversations with climate leaders where I'm told that flyover country just needs to be ignored, and that we just need to ignore and move past and just push right through the people who are trying to go against us, when in reality they actually have a lot of the same concerns we do. We have to move past that. We must move past an approach that basically says that we need to just have a big government, hands-on policy that's at the throats of everyone to solve this problem. We must move past the doom and gloom and the alarmism that is scary for people, but that makes people who are struggling to put food on the table not care about this issue as much because it's down on the priority list, and being told that this is the worst problem that we've ever had since the start of humanity, when they're struggling to just get their crops off of their farm to us, they will never care about it if we continue that approach. We must embrace an approach that includes all communities, that listens to all communities, that we visit these communities. I can guarantee that most of the climate activists, the AOCs of the world, the Gretas of the world, they do important work to raise the prioritization and the narrative on this. But we have, no matter if you're AOC, Greta, or me, or anybody in between, we have to be visiting these communities. We must include them. We must understand where they're coming from. We must look at the priorities that they have and try to marry them with the climate solutions that we all know that we need. We also must make the environment about environmentalism again. This is about the physical planet that we love so much. This is about the beautiful areas that have captivated our country, like the Yellowstone TV show and our national parks. This is about the legacy of protecting our environment. And when we make that a part of environmentalism again, we get a whole new crop of people involved. Those are the values that the future of the climate movement must have. Because this is not a debate of who is right and who is wrong, who is good versus who is bad. This is a debate of how we can find commonalities, use common language, understand each other, and find solutions that work for our own individual communities. That's what fighting climate change should be about. And I've been told by so many donors and environmental NGO CEOs and different activists that we shouldn't even try to engage with those communities that have been out of this conversation for so long. But what I tell them is this: the only thing that's more impossible than engaging those communities is fighting climate change without those communities. There is no way to solve climate change. It is absolutely impossible if we don't. So it is imperative that we break out of our silos. It's imperative that we go to places that are uncomfortable. It's imperative that we have discussions that are incredibly, incredibly unwelcome in the climate space. It's important to understand how we can use that reality and make it a global reality, because as someone who's gone to the United Nations COP, this is something that has been an issue there too. In other countries, they're having the same problem. So we must turn environmentalism on its head and make it about the environment again, bring these communities into the discussion, and I promise you that there is more common ground than what we think. I promise you that it's more than what we see on Twitter. I promise you it's more than what we hear on Tucker Carlson and on Rachel Maddow. We all know that, but we have to live it. We have to breathe it, and we must make climate change the least partisan topic in the American politic today. And if we don't, we can't solve it. With you guys here in this room, the leaders in this room, we can do that. And it's an honor to be with you this morning. Thank you so much.
Please welcome Executive Editor of The Washington Post, Sally Busby, and Editor-in-Chief of The Guardian, Catherine Viner, with Catherine Murdoch.
Great, thank you so much to Sally Busby from The Washington Post and Catherine Viner from The Guardian. We have two of our climate champions in journalism here with us. And I first want to start by calling out what's great about some of the coverage. I'm really so excited to see that the Washington Post has a whole climate solutions section. That's really wonderful. And I particularly wanted to note an article by Rebecca Solnit that The Guardian published, talking about the fact that we need new climate stories. And that's a little bit what I want to talk about today. So tell me a little bit about this moment in time that we are in. We are changing the story about climate change. We've gone from letting everyone know that it's a problem to figuring out how to talk about solutions. So, Sally, tell me a little bit about why did you start this Climate Solutions, and how are you finding the reaction?
Mm-hmm. I think it's exactly that. I think we started to understand that there was sort of finally interest in the story that was beyond purely political, obviously the political aspects of the story remain very important, as do the policy aspects, but people were starting to actually readers respond to things like extreme weather events, and we could tell that they were hungry for sort of climate explanations. They were starting to respond to stories about people who were affected by climate change, and they were actually starting to respond to things like innovation and solution, and this sort of concept of what do I do in my own life. And so we really just kind of started to see that readers really were responding to these stories in different ways, and we sensed that there was opportunity there at this moment. I don't know exactly why that has changed, but it definitely has. And I do think that especially as you go down younger in readers, you are finding people who are somewhat turned off by the politics, but deeply interested in the subject.
And Catherine, what about you? What are the new climate stories that are resonating with your audience?
I mean, it's very interesting. We used to joke about 15 years ago. We've had a big climate team for a long time, and we used to joke at one point that we had more people writing about climate than reading about climate. And then something happened, I think maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago, and the audience went absolutely massive. And I still think there is a role for those those terrifying stories, as long as they're scientifically literate, as long as you do them when it's really good research, and it's really, I still think it's really important to do those. But I think fear is only one way to get people to respond, and I think another way is through stories that inspire them. There's one story we had a few weeks ago, which was just about a community in Bristol who had got together and built the biggest wind turbine in Britain. And it was just, they'd literally raised the money themselves, and it went crazy. And you could see people all around the country saying, well, we could do this, we could do this. And you sort of think, you know, particularly for communities, when politicians aren't really responding, as many aren't as they should, communities will respond, because I really think people get it now, and I'm just not sure that it's the politicians who are in touch.
And Sally, how are what metrics are you using to decide what stories to pursue? Or are you using metrics to decide that? And if not, how do you make decisions about which stories to cover and which not?
I mean, we don't so much as, we don't really like sit there every day and go, you know, oh, that topic is resonating, we'll do more on that. But we do, the way that we really use metrics are to understand if we're not sort of meeting the audience where they really are, right? I mean, if we're not actually, if we're doing our journalism and it's not actually being read, that's about, you know, one of the most damning things that can be said for us. We want to actually give people good information and have them read and consume it and then use it in their lives, right? And so I think the big change for us has been to think about the story. So if you know, 6 years ago, we were all frustrated because we were writing stories about big policy issues, or we were writing very catastrophizing sorts of studies, and people were really not responding to those very much. I think it's accurate to say that, right? And so we are trying to be more informal, we're trying to be more accessible, we're trying to tell more stories visually, including with data visualization, which is really one of the breakthroughs, I think, in storytelling right now. But I am keenly conscious that I don't want to do any of that in any sort of shallow or facile way. And so we're really trying to make sure that we're covering the policy, we're covering the accountability journalism, we're doing investigative reporting on these topics, but then we are also layering either over that or next to it, you know, stories that really are more accessible to people and that do give them useful information day to day about how to live their lives. I was very nervous about doing that in too shallow of a fashion, and I think much of our challenge is to ensure that we keep that rigor of the science while also providing more useful stories day to day.
And how do you think about that leading on the stories that need to be told versus meeting the audience where they are? Or I know that often we want to bring it to the personal level, but it's very important with climate change that we don't put the burden of guilt on people, individuals, because an individual is not going to make a difference. Not one individual all by themselves. We need to focus on solutions that are really to the scale of the problem. But journalism wants to bring it down to the personal level. How do you balance those things?
It's a great question, and we have many debates about that internally. I don't want to get to the point where we are reassuring, we're not trying to reassure people that if they buy green plastic or green sandwich bags or whatever, that they're going to solve the problems. And so for us, it really is a mix of making sure that we are doing very strenuous policy coverage, but also I do think that there is, if this story seems completely hopeless to people, they are not going to engage with it, right? And especially young people, they actually want to know what they can do. And so I think both doing that in a policy fashion, when we hired a journalist who we're calling a climate coach, columnist, and the first thing that person asked me was, well, can I talk about policy too? And I was like, absolutely, Mike, you have to talk about policy. This is not about, what you do with your garbage only. This is also has to be, if you care about this issue, what do you do in the world? And so that climate coach is going to try to break down policy, break down potential bills for people in a more accessible way too. I fundamentally don't think that, there's like the spinach you're supposed to eat and then there's the flashy, accessible journalism. Really, our challenge is to bring those two things together and to make these stories more accessible to people. I don't say appealing, I say accessible. I think that's really the key.
I'm just going to stick on policy for one more minute. I anecdotally, no one outside of the climate community knows how much climate policy has been passed in the US in the last 6 months. it has been actually a huge success, and most people think that it hasn't. It's not because you're not covering it. How do we get people engaged in something as complex and hard to understand as climate policy? Knowing that if we don't, they will think the government doesn't work and maybe not vote the next time.
I mean, this is not unique, obviously, to climate. People don't really know what's going on with tax policy in the United States. They're not really sure what's going on with, law enforcement policy in the United States. There are obviously engaged people. I do think that writing those stories both straightforwardly but also accessibly is important. But I think one of the things to do is, this is just a way that journalism operates, is that when people are interested in a topic, right, we can't control the moments when people are interested in topics. But what we try to do is to, at the moments when those high points of interest happen, like be there with good explanatory information about the law that went into effect, 6 months ago. They're probably not going to necessarily read it the day it passes unless they are policy-focused people, but they might be interested in things like electric car incentives, at some moment that is different. So it's almost like breaking up the components of the policy or the law and giving those in the form of explanatory journalism when those moments are hot, right? I found, remember when the heat dome happened on the West Coast in the summer of 2021? All of a sudden we found that people were going back and reading explanatory stories about climate change that we had written months earlier, right? And so it's capturing those moments when people, for whatever reason, have intense interest and making the most of those.
The Guardian has a very different business model than the Washington Post. How do you think this affects what you're able to do?
Yeah, so for people who don't know, we're available to everyone. We don't have a paywall, and we ask people to contribute through voluntarily. And what that means is that we have really massive scale, and that anyone can read us, even if all they need is a phone. They don't need any money. And we ask people, you pay so that someone else can read for free. And what that means is that we're massive, and we can absolutely tell stories to everybody. There's no barriers to finding us. And I think that's meant we have a real impact, and one of the things that really drives us is how can we make an impact all around the world with the journalism, and really sort of talk to people in ways that influence them.
And even with a philanthropic model, you still need an audience. And so the audience, in fact, maybe even especially with a philanthropic model, you need an audience. How have you managed to grow that audience while focusing on a topic that most commercial enterprises have found difficult?
I have to say, for us, it's an absolute driver, is our climate coverage. And it has been, I became editor in 2015. It's been one of our big drivers of audience. It's a big driver of reader revenue. Lots of people read climate stories and contribute immediately afterwards. And it's a sort of, it's a hot area, the Guardian, that people want to work on. We've got, it's a very global team. We've got people all around the world who, got somebody on the Amazon. So it's just a big priority for us, and I think our readers can tell that. It's backed up. We don't take fossil fuel advertising since 2019. We're a B Corp, and so I think as a business as well, people can see that we sort of mean what we say.
This is a difficult moment in time for the media business in general. There's been a lot of change, particularly for local news. Although I think that there has been some movement forward. We support the American Journalism Project, which works on local news. And it does seem like a multi-revenue business model of some kind works, whether there's a philanthropic strain to it or a business strain to it, having events and membership and that sort of thing. How do you think that at this particular moment in time for media, how does that affect coverage of something like climate? Yeah,
it's a great question. Kat and I sit up here, and we're two of the best resourced news organizations in the world. So we're on the lucky end of the spectrum, right? And we never have enough, but like we have sustainable business models, we know where we are. Local news is under enormous pressure in the US. I think one of the things that has been the most hopeful in the last couple of years, I worked at the Associated Press before I joined the Post, and there has been some really interesting nonprofit funding of very, very severely undercovered areas of of society in the United States. Some of that has focused on just very underserved communities. Some of it has focused on things like climate coverage or equity coverage in places where there are literally no independent journalists who are able to work, or if there are courageous local independent journalists, they're basically doing it in their spare time or with actually no financial support whatsoever. So I do actually think, although it has some challenges, that for many media, especially local media, some of the nonprofit funding of reporting, of coverage areas, not necessarily of advocacy, because people can't really make good decisions unless they have a strong information. And I know that, I don't think anybody wants to give up on, just because there's misinformation in the world doesn't mean we shouldn't be engaged in the fight. I mean, we want there to be good, solid information about what the government is doing, what the science is behind something like climate change. And I think that the missing part of this conversation is that people do tend to trust local media more than they're going to trust big national news organizations. They do trust people like meteorologists who are in their living rooms. And there really are some, I think, under-leveraged ways that good, I'm not in the business of advocacy. I'm in the business of good, solid, factual, science-based information and making sure that people are actually consuming that, right? And I think there's some creative things that could be done even more with local media and making sure that local media in this country doesn't disappear, because that would be very bad for civic society all across on climate and on 1,000 other issues. So just like, little on the soapbox here, people tend to focus too much on what's going on with national media and not actually focus enough on the incredibly important role that local media plays in what people actually think and believe, I would say.
Climate change is another sort of unique property in that it is huge time scale. How do you think about covering something with that type of time scale?
Well, yeah, it is huge timescale, but it's also happening right now. I think one of the things we've tried to do in recent years is show people how it's happening right now, and it's happening, and people are starting to feel it happening right now in all of their communities, in whichever communities they live in. The previous speaker, that's happening in those communities. And I think that's when people really start to pay really great attention. Although it also, when it's happening, when half of Pakistan is under floodwater, I think they also pay attention. So we think, I think although it's talking about the longest possible term, I think our job is to bring it into the immediate.
I often say, sometimes it's media is heavily denigrated by most people, but I think that much of the time when they're sort of hating on media, they're actually saying there are things about human nature that I don't like. There are things about, we have a bad news bias, we are interested in conflict, sometimes we don't have a long attention span, et cetera. How do you think about covering conflict in this space versus success? Mm-hmm. And how does the sort of journalistic culture impact that? And I'm thinking specifically around, investigative journalism is usually taking somebody down. And that's usually what prizes are given out for. And there's a cynicism in a lot of the newsrooms, right? That sort of say, well, yes, this business says it's going to do something, but let's go see if it really is doing this. at the same time, you say that the public is really looking for success. They're looking for seeing progress. How do you think about, does the culture of journalism need to change in order to be, to bring the right stories to the public on this?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we've got to keep holding the powerful to account, I have to say. And I think a lot of the powerful are the polluters who need revealing, or the fossil fuel companies who knew decades before anyone else that their products were causing the climate to change. So I think that's absolutely essential part of what we do. At the same time, showing the human aspects, I always frame it as reporting on people as well as power. So it is holding the powerful accountable. I think that's the key role for media, for news media. But telling the human stories, the inspirational stories, giving people, I say, ideas, not just critiques. So giving people ideas about how to create a better world, not just kicking the one we're in.
Yeah, I mean, I basically feel the same way. I mean, I actually, part of what we are aiming to do in the next couple of years is, as I said, to kind of radically increase the amount of international investigative reporting that we do around the subject of climate, because I do actually think that there are some incredibly important accountability stories. I think what you're referring to, and I think this is true, is that this story was such a political football in the US for so long that it basically became sort of just a political football story. And I think, but I think that is kind of the battle of the past. I don't mean that it's going away, but I think that there are an enormous number of people who are interested, and it's not all just feel-good stories. They're actually interested in some of the science. They're interested in some of the innovation. We heard, I think you guys are hearing like this building materials conversation, and I think there's just enormous sort of practical interest in that kind of thing right now. I'm not sure exactly why. I think it is probably because people are starting to see this in their day-to-day lives. And the thing that happens is that when a story moves from just being a political football to actually being sort of like a textured, nuanced, sort of multi-layered stories, that's where we as journalists, like, then there's opportunity. Then we can tell story about small inspirational things that are happening. Then we can tell stories about, companies that are grappling with, what's really going to happen. I mean, we did a piece about 2 weeks ago that was, well, it was about a week ago, I guess, that was looking at the battle in California about storing water during these big, what are they going to do to store water during amazing sort of, atmospheric river moments, and then they get a drought. And that story got enormous interest, but it was much more sort of a normal, it was this is what's happening in California. And it had the climate science in there, but it was then just a normal sort of like, what's the government gonna do? What's the impact on my life? What's this gonna do to my taxes? That kind of thing. And I do think that as the story becomes more relevant to people day to day, that we're sort of gonna get past this, it's just a political football, because one of the opportunities is, city managers are grappling with these things in real time. Those are the types of stories that I think actually will draw an audience going forward. So I don't know, Kat's in a different place because Europe and the UK have always, paid more attention to this story. To me, what we're really just trying to do is we're trying to actually capture what we see as a change in the audience, and push that forward to what journalism is needed now. I don't know that like anything we did 5 years ago is creating this change. I think we're seeing the change, and we're trying to actually leap on it and do the journalism that the moment requires right now.
Okay, final question. It's a big one, and we only have a minute left. So it's 2043.
Oh, there is a 2043.
Yeah, 2043. It's 2043, and it's a job well done. We're looking back on a job well done. What did you do right? What are you proud of in your climate coverage? Why did we succeed?
I mean, we should have done these investments, 5 years ago. We'll look back and I'm sure say that. I think I want to make sure we stayed focused on the policy, because that is still the biggest lever, and not ignore that. I think that's one of the things I would say.
Okay, we will hold all the powerful polluters to account and shame them in the streets. we will tell the human stories of the people who inspire and are, creating new ideas for the future. We will collaborate with other news organizations and with NGOs and with anyone with an interesting story, so that we're aiming for the public interest, not our interest. We will diversify our coverage and our journalists, because this is a social justice issue as well as a climate issue. And also, in 2043, people will say that in 2023, everything changed because of that amazing story that The Guardian did. The whole world changed. The climate crisis stopped dead that year.
Excellent. On that note, thank you very much.
Congresswoman Shelley Pingree, Sodexo's Kate Shearer, with Chef Barton Seaver.
Hey everyone, what an honor to be here with you today. One little thing I've got to take care of first. My little 6-year-old boy likes to send me around with his favorite Darth Vader to be with me. And why do we do anything but for each other, especially for our children? And I'm so fortunate to be able to be here today with two very good friends, very admired colleagues, to talk to you about something that's awesome, which is food, right? Food is an act of love. Food is an act of kindness. It is a generosity. It is how we share ourselves with the world. It is how we identify ourselves in our world and share that with others. And so I just want to say, first off, I love you so much. Thank you for being here to do something you love with people that I greatly admire. Kate, would you please introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Shearer. I am the Director of Sustainability for Sodexo's campus segment. If you don't know Sodexo, we are a global food service company. We believe in bringing quality of life to our customers every day in those little interactions, which food is a great way to connect with people.
Hi, I'm Shelley Pingree. I represent the 1st Congressional District of Maine. We only have 2 in Maine. And I'm the ranking member on the Interior and Environment Appropriations Subcommittee. I also serve on the Agriculture Committee. I've been in Congress for 14 years, so I've worked on multiple farm bills. And my goal this year is to work on agriculture and climate change. In my other life, I live on a tiny island that takes 1 hour to get to by ferry off the coast of Maine. And I've been a certified organic farmer most of my life, and I'm in the hospitality business because it's Maine.
Awesome. And as in Maine, everybody's got a hustle in so many ways, so many interesting people there. So we do have sort of a Maine focus here today, and I have the role of both moderator and panelist. So my name is Barton Seaver. I am neuronutrition faculty at Harvard, as well as a National Geographic explorer, recovering chef and restaurateur. And all of the things that I do are based on how do we create positive public health outcomes through food. And that's what we get to talk about here today. So Shelley, I want to talk about that Farm Bill first off. So the Farm Bill is, well, I think it's wrongly named because it's called the Farm Bill, but really it's a bill about what we want our society to look like. 10% of it is really about farming, 10% of it is about ecology and environmental protection, but 80% of it is really about nutrition. It's really the food stamp bill. So to me, it's a conversation about what do we want our society to look like, and I think really a conversation about what responsibility do we have to each other here in this richest nation in the world. And I'd like to ask you sort of about the bloody bare-knuckle brawl that is the Farm Bill, renegotiation every 5 years, where we are with that now.
Exactly. So this is the 2023 Farm Bill. And as Barton says, we do this every 5 years. And we have a few knockdown, drag-out fights. Sometimes it takes us 2 years to reauthorize a bill. This year, with the divided Congress, it may possibly be the only bill that moves forward, but we'll see what happens. So as you heard, the majority of the Farm Bill goes to nutrition, and I'll set that aside for last. So we're going to have a lot of fights about nutrition. And in the wealthiest country in the world, we should not be arguing about whether or not you can feed your family for $5 per person per day, because none of us could possibly do that. The other part part where we're going to have some knockdown, drag-out fights possibly is around the subject of agriculture and climate change. And I'll just briefly talk about 11% of our carbon emissions come from agriculture, carbon and methane. And I've written a bill called the Agriculture Resilience Act. That is my take on the things that we really need to focus on to deal with climate change in agriculture. And it's got a few sections, and I'll just describe them. One of them is research, because we have to research what we're going to into the future. A major section on soil health, and I won't get all geeky, but we all know that you can sequester carbon in the soil. And if everybody used great agricultural practices around the world, we wouldn't be having this conference and we wouldn't be talking about these things, because we would be pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere through the roots of our plants. Farmland protection and viability, we cannot afford to lose any more farmland right now and turn it into development. Pasture-based livestock, because that is the best way to raise animals and make sure that we're recycling their manure and that we're keeping that carbon in the soil. On-farm renewable energy, to make sure all of our farmers are using renewable energy. And food waste. We waste 30% of the food in this nation. That should be going to the very people who need more to eat. Farm Bill.
Wow.
101.
Well, that is a professional right there. Wow. So I want to back up a little bit. Just a question for you, Kate, because I think something that we often fail to do in sustainability conversations, even in public health, I think, well, less so in public health conversations, is talk about what is the purpose of this, sort of backing up. What is it that we're trying to sustain, ultimately? And I'd ask you, a simple question, what's the purpose of food?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's about survival. It's about thriving. It's about fueling us to do what we need to do, whether it's learn, care for others, just subsist in our families and our lives. So it's that basic, right? It's about survival.
Yeah. Well, it's about, I think, ultimately our ability to thrive. As well. And one of the things that I so admire about your work on campus particularly is this is such a hotbed of intellectual activity. Obviously, people are going there to expand their brains, expand their worldview. And you are there literally on the front lines serving that, enabling that, creating the ability for students to thrive. And you shared something with me just this morning when we were sitting around, that 1 in 3 college students in this country are food insecure. So how do we, in the conversation of environmental sustainability and public health, even just public decency of feeding our neighbors, how does this all manifest itself sort of literally on the ground in the soil? Maybe you could use Maine as an example, all the way through to the food on the plate.
Yeah, I mean, so Sodexo, one of our key levers to address equitable food systems, to address our net zero by 2040 carbon goals, is to think about how do we support regenerative, sustainable agriculture and aquaculture. Without that, we are not going to be able to continue to feed people. As you mentioned, on our college campuses, a lot of students are really struggling with food insecurity, more so than at the scale of our national landscape, which is really surprising when you think of the cost of education. People are there really learning how to feed themselves for the very first time. So we have this really important responsibility to come there and provide education and equitable access to food, but also to play a role in the community itself and to support those local growers right in our backyards. So we're really proud of the work we're doing in Maine to shift our food spend to Maine growers. We've spent $7 million over the last 8 years shifting products that we buy to serve our students to Maine growers.
And $7 million in Maine is a big deal. We're talking about a very rural economy. Maine is sort of a microcosm of the macrocosm. We're the oldest state in the union per capita. We have one of the greatest wealth distribution differentials there. We just so much, so goes Maine, so goes the union in so many ways. Kate has a sort of somewhat scandalous statement. She says, broccoli is where it's at. And, would you talk to us about sort of that
My 6-year-old would disagree with that, but apparently broccoli is the #1 most consumed vegetable on a college campus. And so...
Who knew?
Right, and we're being challenged to bring as much local, sustainable produce and products to campus as well. So where do you find broccoli in the middle of Maine in the middle of winter, right? So we had to solve for that. And so we have worked with a number of partners in Maine to sort of transform that main grower production cycle. We work with an amazing partner that is buying broccoli from local Maine growers. They have worked with the blueberry industry to help shift their infrastructure so that we can flash freeze the broccoli the other parts of the season when the blueberries are not using that infrastructure. And so it's not only providing another revenue stream to the blueberry industry, it's allowing the broccoli growers to expand their production to be able to serve, the institutional buyers year-round. So we're now able to bring a healthy product, at an affordable price to our college campuses, and we're promoting the broccoli growers. We had a broccoli takeover event at 11 of the UMaine campuses the other week. So it's fun.
I mean, it's entirely sexy, right? A broccoli takeover.
Broccoli cheddar soup, broccoli stir fry.
Hey, this is all good stuff. So backing away from Maine for a second, part of this conversation here. So from a global perspective, talking about what a food system represents. So from a climate and greenhouse gas emission standpoint, we're talking about roughly about 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, the vast majority of that from food production. About 50% of that is basically land animal proteins and what goes to feed them. But when we look at some of the global economic numbers, because I think there's so many different ways to approach solutions and how to measure them, talk about them in ways that people can really adapt to and understand. So the global food system is valued about $9 trillion for what we consume. But the global food system costs us $20 trillion, $11 trillion in negative public health impacts, and about $7 trillion in environmental impacts. And then another $1 trillion or so in terms of the burden that society bears for negative public health outcomes. So we're talking about, not to make people a crass measure of just GDP, but wow. I mean, this is an incredible way to invest in people. Exactly. And when we invest in people through food, guess what? I mean, the solution for public health, positive public health outcomes, is the exact same solutions as we want to see for greenhouse gas mitigation in our food systems. And so there is this giant win, and there's this giant pot of, well, right now, loss that could be turned into something really magnificent. And when I say GDP and per capita production, again, that's sort of a crass way to say, but really what we're talking about is the ability for people to thrive. When we talk about the positive public health outcomes of diets rich in seafood, rich in grains, legumes, beans, greens, all the things we know we need to eat, quality of life increases, length of life increases. In America, actually globally, our health span, meaning the number of years that we live where we are healthy, free of the burden of disease, is 13 years less than our lifespan, the number of years that we live. Wow. I mean, right there is a quality of life, ability to thrive aspect to this. So you had mentioned aquaculture, which to me, in Farm Bill and Agriculture Resilience Act, so this is a bare knuckle brawl to retrofit these food systems that we already have in place. But with aquaculture, we have this opportunity to really very intentionally build a brand new food system. Aquaculture globally is about 60 years old as a commodity market, though we've been practicing it for thousands of years, mostly on indigenous knowledge that we can now lean on for answers to our current issues. But we are architects and witness to the creation of a brand new food system. How cool is that? Last time we got to do that was 10,000 years ago, right? And so we have this opportunity to very intentionally set the framework of what we want a food system to be, what its end result should be. And so what's your work around aquaculture through food service production and purchasing?
Right. So animal proteins is one of the largest contributors to our carbon footprint as a company. And so we are really looking at how do we shift diets to consider lower carbon footprint protein sources, whether it's aquaculture sources or plant-based. We actually have a commitment around shifting our resident dining menus and campuses to 42% plant-based by 2025. And so we're looking at innovative ways and innovative industries that can help us come up with new ingredients, new recipes and platforms. Kelp is a really versatile, healthy ingredient that we are investing in Maine. There's a really positive collaboration with the Maine lobster industry, where during their off-season, they are being provided kelp seed to produce that so that they have an additional income stream during their off-season. It's helping them diversify when sea level temperatures are really having a negative impact on that industry at large. And Sodexo is really interested in that product from a health standpoint, but also just innovation. I mean, Gen Z is so interested in more plant-based.
It also, the great thing about kelp is it sequesters carbon in the ocean. So it's a great source of that. And there are people even working on carbon sequestration programs that are just about putting putting kelp all over the ocean, as well as growing it in aquaculture. The other thing that's coming up in the Farm Bill that's, I think, really important is a shift in thinking about how do we get people more healthy fruits and vegetables. The idea that food is medicine, but food is preventative medicine. And that's, what you're all about and what you're teaching about. But really, we have some programs that we're trying to enhance. One's called GusNIP, which is some funny initials named after Gus Schumacher. But it basically says, if you take your SNAP benefit card to a farmer's market, we'll give you double the value in fresh fruits and vegetables. A prescription produce prescription program, thank you, that's great. Produce prescription program that says, if you go to your practitioner and your family is at risk or you're already at risk with heart disease, childhood obesity, diabetes, any of those things, your practitioner can give you a prescription and you take it to the grocery store or a farmer's market and you get fresh fruits and vegetables, because we know what a huge impact that has on you. And so shifting the debate to not just calories, but broccoli. You got one of the best statistics of all about eating salmon and brain health, but it's really a good, it fits into the whole model about why are we spending money on the other end for healthcare needs when we could be making sure our kids get proper brain development and health. And what was that number again? It's amazing.
Well, science coming out of University of Texas, Dr. Tom Brenna and the Seafood Nutrition Partnership, if mothers in utero as well as breastfeeding are eating a copious amount of seafood rich in omega-3 fatty acids, on average, you're getting 7.7 increased IQ points in your children. When you start talking about the later in life benefits, 17% overall reduction in health-related mortality incidences when we switch out red meat for 2 seafood meals per week. This is a moral issue when it comes down to it for me, that we get more seafood into more people's diets. And luckily, that's where I really think with aquaculture, we have this incredible opportunity to very intentionally build a food system that is purposed with positive public health outcomes. And specifically in America, we have this wonderful capacity. We are sort of what California's Central Valley's equivalent, in the water in terms of the exponential opportunity we have to create incredible quality food, quality blue jobs, move into a new blue economy. Hope really is in the water. And this is globally, especially because aquaculture in particular employs a significant amount of women in the workforce. And so it creates this economic and public health powerhouse in communities all over the globe. And it really comes down to the fact that it needs social license. We don't understand what aquaculture is necessarily. If I describe to you a farm, you're there all of a sudden, instantly, right? You get it. The undulating hills bathed in autumn splendor setting sun with perfectly patterned rows of corn, that white house, paint chipping, red barn, color fading, like, hot damn, John Cougar Mellencamp in the background. We get this, right? But if I ask you to describe a fishery or a farm, most people just can't get there. We look gaze wistfully out at the wine dark sea and think it happens elsewhere, beyond the horizon of our attentions. But really, it is a reflection of us. It is a food system. It is our virtues and values that we want to see on the plate. And so with that, I would ask, sort of in the opportunity to articulate a national food purpose statement, do you think we could ever do that? We have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness enshrined in our national founding document. All of that is based on food. Do you think we could ever get to a
State of Maine
point?
passed a bill on the right to food, and this very idea that everyone should have a basic right to food. It seems so fundamental, it seems bizarre to be the wealthiest country in the nation. And the one hitch, I'll tell you, that gets in our way during the Farm Bill and during with a lot of other policy that I work on, is more money is spent in the food and agriculture and food processing industry to lobby Congress than the defense industry. That's when we forget about the real purpose of food. When Barton asked us in the beginning, the purpose of food is to keep you healthy and to keep you going every day and develop your brain. But we've turned food into all these other things. And a lot of people in the food industry don't want to lose their hold on ultra-processed snacks and all the other things and the nutrition in school lunch. And we're going to have massive kinds of fights about this. But let's get right down to it. You cannot feed your family on $5 per person per day. It just doesn't work to have healthy fruits and vegetables at that price.
And with that, we're out of time here, so I just wanted to point out that Kate's company, Sodexo, is providing a wonderful vegan meal, putting all that we have talked about here on stage literally into your hands so that you may thrive. I love you all so much. Thanks for being here.
And now, CEO of Drone Seed, Grant Canary.
I'm going to try and bring as much energy as Barton did there. All right, so you will know us as Drone Seed. I'm going to talk a little bit, that's going to change by the end of the day here. I'm going to talk a little bit about our journey, building an end-to-end solution to restore burned forests at scale. We're going to establish that the problem to the reforestation supply chain is not an understatement. So a little on our journey. 2021, we raised a significant $36 million Series A with some very esteemed investors. We used that capital to acquire Silvaseed, 133 years old in 2021, and we built the tech to double year-over-year seed collections. We did that in partnership with local communities, and we now manage a majority of the Northwest forest seed inventory. We're making more seed available to frontline communities that are impacted by fire. And so I am pleased to utilize the day to announce another acquisition, which is of CalForest Nurseries. So with that, we now grow the majority of California's trees. So to encompass the whole suite of solutions from seed to seedlings to offset issuance in post-fire sites, we've created a new company. Mass Reforestation is the parent company for Silvaseed, CalForest, and Drone Seed. The mission, however, remains entirely the same: restore burned forests at scale. So now that we've established we are a significant player in the US supply chain, we can very authoritatively say the supply chain isn't there to restore resiliently at scale today. Not yet. It needs technology. So to take a look at wildfire emissions globally, in 2021, they were double that of Germany's as an entire country. In California, the 2020 wildfires emitted 127 million metric tons, one fire season. That eliminated 18 years of hard-won reductions by the state of California, which were only 65 million metric tons. That doesn't measure the yearly water loss, the water treatment, or the biodiversity. That's just one data point there. So it is absolutely critical to restore these carbon sinks. Now, how is it that an industry that's been around for decades isn't able to rise to the challenge? What has changed? Why is the supply chain overwhelmed? Well, the industry was accustomed through a century of fire exclusion to being able to have 10 years to respond to a 10,000-acre fire. That is obviously no longer the case. You're obviously all very aware of the numbers that are in the 100,000s, if not millions, regularly with multiple fires. And if the industry couldn't get to it, well, then nature could, right? I mean, that's what I was taught in high school bio. Forest burns, forest regrows, right? Well, think about what you know about glaciers, coral. With climate change, we're seeing a decrease in natural regeneration. It used to be around 90% would regenerate after a fire. Now we're seeing that drop to 60%, 40%, depending upon the species and the ecosystem. So every step of the supply chain is blocked. We don't expect you to know what those are, but it's the collection of the seed, it's the planting and cultivation of the seedlings, it's getting it out to site, whether it's by people or drones, and then it's the finance, the paying for it. Because if the tree is just burned, well, typically, that's where the revenue comes from. The timber revenues pay for reforestation. So where's that money gonna come from? So what we're doing is we're tapping into a rapidly growing market of carbon offsets, projected to reach 50 billion by 2030, at 2 billion today, inside of a much larger market. And more growth is coming. So the SEC has approved a rule, 3-to-1, final language is out in April, that publicly traded companies must disclose their emissions, which is going to provide a huge tailwind. So to tap into that, we've created reforestation as a service. And in 2022, with Henry Creek, we doubled landowner investment. So 300 acres, our offsets sold out. 2023, with Sheep Creek, we eliminated the need for landowner investment entirely, because again, where's that money gonna come from? And we're providing a return that is superior to timber on a net present value basis. And we 10x the size. So we're having those conversations around the offsets now. There are 7.5 million acres in just the US of other land managers each year that need these services, and that is what we are scaling to. We connect with local community members to work with these land managers. The consulting foresters who brought us the Sheep Creek project because they knew this would be a very difficult project to undertake. We have 2 million tons of projects in development and 10 million plus that were in dialogue, and that number is rapidly increasing. Now, carbon offsets. There's been some criticism here. We absolutely welcome that criticism. There's 140 plus standards right now. It accelerates the development of the highest quality offsets. Our offsets are top tier in quality, and the numbers show it just based on the volume traded, and also the highest price, which is removals, which are a subtype. That is because of the monitoring, reporting, and verification, that MRV, and the additionality that we do under the Climate Action Reserve methodology. So reminder, these are forests that were unlikely to naturally regenerate. There's a 1-year confirmation by an accredited third-party forester who comes out after the last planting a year later, and there's 100+ years of funded monitoring by a nationally accredited land trust, another third party. They get an endowment, much like a college, it's invested in the market, provides a percentage return. That's what pays for an annual site report and a site visit every 5 years for the next 100 years. Lastly, there's an insurance buffer pool. What happens if there's another fire? Well, every project, just like auto and health insurance, contributes into the buffer pool. And if there's a reversal, then the offsets are removed from that buffer pool. So our purchasers, like Shopify and others, know that it's either coming from our project or the buffer pool. Now, we expect fire to happen, but we expect our trees to live, and that's because we plant at much lower densities. We plant multiple native species, that's polyculture, and we collect seed from as close to the fire as possible in advance of the fire, ideally, but often after the fire as well. So really good reforestation is a hell of a lot of work, and that is why our first project sold out. And these are some of our buyers, not all of them, because there are still some announcements that are coming. But these entities are deeply excited about the tech that we are bringing to enable this growth. The software that has enabled us to double year-over-year collections and make that seed available. The hardware that we're utilizing to cultivate and grow the seedlings in half the time. And we're growing the first purpose-grown plug or seedling for post-fire sites. So this optimizes for water and heat. We're utilizing a number of different technologies and are really excited about biodiversity monitoring and credits. And then we're doing all of this with no upfront cost to landowner and a return that is superior to timber on a net present value basis. So we are mass reforestation. We are restoring for resilience. We welcome the conversation and excited to be chatting with many of you today, and my colleagues here are able to have this conversation with myself. Now, I've whipped through this, so the QR code is there on there, so if you would like to take a look a little bit more, yep, there's the cameras, there we go. Thank you so much.
And now, Elena Wood, Isaias Hernandez, and Christy Drutman with Teen Vogue's Allegra Kirkland.
My name is Allegra Kirkland. I'm the politics director at Teen Vogue, and I'm thrilled to be here for this conversation on how we deal with climate doomerism. I'm joined by three phenomenal panelists. Christy Drutman is the founder of Brown Girl Green and the co-founder of the Green Jobs Board. Isaias Hernandez is the founder of Queer Brown Vegan. And Elena Wood is a sustainability scientist, climate communicator, and the founder of the wonderfully named Garbage Queen. So, Elena, I hope to start with you. I've heard you say that you don't really encounter outright, climate deniers anymore. You're much more likely to meet people who fall more into this climate doomer camp, especially young people. So they basically think, it's too late to do anything about the climate crisis. So kind of a two-part question. One is when you notice this shift happening and what you think prompted it. And then two is, what are some of the harms associated with climate doomerism? Like, why is it such a dangerous path for people to go down?
So climate doom has overtaken climate denial in the last 5 years. Obviously, there are still people online especially who will claim they don't believe in climate change, but as we're realizing, a lot of that is trolls and bots. So the vast majority of people do believe that climate change is real. But when the shift to this climate doom started happening was honestly when a lot of developed Western nations started experiencing the worst impacts of climate change, whereas the Global South, the frontline communities, have been experiencing these awful disasters for years. And the real danger was that with this is that people will give up on activism. We know we need the numbers in order to address climate change, in order to push forward climate action and justice. And when people believe it's too late, why would they fight?
Yeah, and I think, I say this one is for you, is, one of the most troubling things to me is that it kind of perpetuates this mentality of like climate change is something off in the future still. It's like, oh, our grandkids may be screwed. What are we going to do? But really, climate change is here, and it's impacting frontline communities right now, all over the globe, all over the U.S., like here in Miami Beach. So, can you talk about some of the kind of like the privilege and the disconnect that kind of undergirds this mentality too?
Yeah, I think it's super important to kind of address how the environmental movement hasn't really done a popular job in actually making those interconnections. Of course, environmental justice has really illustrated that, but I think when it comes to the future of the planet, we have to kind of admit that climate doomerism upholds white supremacist narratives, and this goes back into immigration work in which I've done, is that, a few years ago when the white supremacists came to El Paso and literally murdered many Latino immigrants, he was very influenced by the Great Replacement theory, and the Great Replacement theory is basically looking at how, in global north countries that migrants are going to replace white people. And the truth is that we need to start to be comfortable to talking about anti-racism, because I think a lot of us can say that we're pro-BLM, pro-LGBT, pro-immigrant rights, but then when it comes to actually saying what we're spreading, perhaps the language that we're saying is not intentional to hurt people, but we have to start to really reframe this narrative that this is a white supremacist issue that we are currently dealing with in our ecological crisis. Poor immigrants of color are not causing the climate crisis. It's corporations that are based in those communities of color that are literally poisoning us and then influencing, white supremacists to come to our communities and to slaughter us. So if you're uncomfortable to talk about your own whiteness and how it upholds racism, then how are you going to be advocating for climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. This one is for all three of you. I'm just wondering what you found to be some of the most effective strategies for combating climate doomerism, whether it's in one-on-one conversations with loved ones or on a bigger scale with your online audiences.
Yeah, I would say for me,
you know, there's so many solutionists around the world, especially in the global south. And, you know, my family's from the Philippines, and, you know, they're on the front lines of the climate crisis. And the thing is, you don't really hear those stories, right? And, you know, as much as we love a good susty fit or, like, you know, living more eco-friendly, at the end of the day, it comes down to survival, adaptation, and resilience for so many communities around the world that it's not a trendy thing, it's actually survival. And I think it doesn't really get recognized that way, that communities on the ground within their own context have the solutions. And it's just a matter of the need of funding, resource redistribution, and, you know, the need of power redistribution to be able to bring that funding. And, you know, we recognize that in the recent climate negotiations with COP27 with the Loss and Damage Fund, but that took my whole lifetime. I was born in 1995. And, like, it took this long for even these little pennies for a Loss and Damage Fund. So it's like, how is the funding going to the communities on the ground that have those stories and solutions? And I think that's how you combat climate doom, because you're actually seeing those resources going to those communities in the context that they need for them to implement those strategies. We don't need any more white savior, you know, these communities need to be saved. These communities are saving themselves every single day, and they're coming up with the solutions right now. So how are we supporting them as allies on the ground and empowering them to have the voice and the agency to take up those spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a lot of us, we can know that general news media has a fatalistic approach in approaching doom and gloom. But I like to really ground my work in evidence-based hope. And to me, evidence-based hope is from my mentor, author Ellen Kelsey, that really defines it as it's not just this rooted wishful thinking. It actually looks at the continued momentum of movements and local solutions happening on the ground. And I use this case study where I visited the Monterey Bay back in January to actually film an independent media series to actually highlight local solutions. And it was really interesting to see how she told me, you know, hope cannot be seen sometimes. Sometimes we look at natural landscapes or we look at our own cities and all we think about, wow, gentrification, housing, risings of cost living, biodiversity loss. But then we don't really connect with local or solutions-based journalism that actually showcases, wow, there is actually on the ground work that is being done. And so I think when I work a lot with nonprofits and institutions to kind of communicate climate science, I always say, like, let's present local solutions, but also be realistic of what is working, what is not working, but celebrate those wins and also losses at the same time.
Absolutely. And as a scientist, I feel like all I do nowadays is scream, it's not too late. Mm-hmm. And about 2 years ago, I got a comment under one of my videos where I was screaming it was not too late, saying, well, then tell me why. Tell me why it's not too late. Sure, the science says it, but what's actually happening? Mm-hmm. So I went from talking mostly about climate issues. I think everyone in this room is well aware of how devastating climate change is and will continue to be if we don't address it. But I went into talking more about solutions and not just, oh, hey, green energy is a thing we need to do. More of how are communities on the ground, particularly in frontline communities in the global south, addressing climate change right now? And how are we scaling up these solutions all over the world? And tying in with that, calls to action for people. I think there's a lot of disconnect between we see an issue, we see a solution, but how do we as individuals play a role in this? And because of that, all I do now is uplift climate solutions from people all over the world, and that has certainly made a difference with my thinking and with my audience's thinking.
Yeah, something we hear all the time from young people at Teen Vogue is that, you know, they got involved in the climate movement out of these feelings of despair, of doom, of like, I need to do something, what can I do? And then they actually found it to be, you know, hugely helpful in addressing those kind of very understandable existential fears, you know? So I think, you know, storytelling and activism and finding community are like really important ways to sort of beat back these feelings. So yeah, couldn't agree more. And then Christy, you touched on this in your answer, this question of mitigation, because I think, I know journalists can be bad about this, but sort of framing climate as this all or nothing issue, right? And you know, the latest IPCC report comes out and all the headlines are like, we have 7 years to save humanity. And like, that's really scary to people. And it's also not really accurate, right? Because there's gonna be billions of people on the earth in 2100. It's just a question of like, what is the earth gonna look like then?
Yeah.
So how do we sort of like make sure we're emphasizing conversations around adaptability, around mitigation, around like the decisions we make right now really matter, you know, in our own communities, at the governmental level, all of that?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing climate change happening right now. So, you know, it's not something in the far off future. We're seeing the impacts happening to communities right now. But it is a matter of degrees, right? A 1.5 degrees Celsius world is way different than a 2 degrees Celsius world. And that's about the magnitude of climate feedback loops. So, you know, at a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, we are gonna see, you know, extreme heating, flooding, you know, loss of species, loss of insects. But at a 2 degrees Celsius world, we're gonna see that, you know, 2-3 times magnitude, right? And I don't think people really realize that. They don't realize we're pretty much already on trajectory of a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, which is scary in itself. But there's still things we can do in different contexts to manage, to mitigate, to adapt to those conditions. Whereas a 2 degrees Celsius world, you know, it's gonna be runaway climate change. There's gonna be, you know, these feedback loops are gonna get faster, bigger magnitude, and communities are on the line. And so we have to address that communities right now, even before a 1.5 degree world, are already being impacted. What's gonna happen to those communities at a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, and what could happen if we don't take action at 2 degrees. So scientists are saying like every 0.1 degree matters for action. I think that gives people hope, right? It feels like something we really have agency to take action on. Because yes, maybe we're set on track towards 1.5 degrees. But if we can keep that down, keep that at a set level, you know, it will still be devastating. Communities will be devastated. Ecosystems, we're gonna lose them, right? Species, we're gonna lose them. But at least we can mitigate those worst impacts to get us further away from the 2% cap, where it's gonna be a lot harder for us to control runaway climate change. And I think we need to make sure that our adaptation strategies are contextual for communities to be able to adapt to those changes.
Mm-hmm. This is just a side note, but I'm wondering with all of you, do you find it useful to like get into it with your commenters ever? Like if you get a real climate doomer like coming on your feed, do you engage, or are you just like, I need to like think at a higher level than just getting into it with every single person?
I block and delete them. Okay. At this point, I've noticed it is not worth my time and energy to debate with someone who clearly is never going to come to our side, is never going to come to the side of science. Mm-hmm. So I just block and delete and move on and try to help people who have climate anxiety or maybe are falling victim to climate doom. That's well worth my time versus ranting with somebody in my comment section.
Where do you get the sense that people are getting these climate doom, like especially young people, getting these climate doomer messages from, like, predominantly?
Newspaper headlines. Unfortunately, there are a lot of clickbaity headlines out there, and a lot of young people love to use this green screen tool on their social media apps to just stand in front of it with some very emotive song in the background and just not add any information. They haven't read the article, it's very clear. Those go viral. And one thing leads to another, and people are like, it's too late. Because of that. But also, it's seeing how we have not taken a lot of climate action up until this point. It's very frustrating as a younger person to be like, I have been in this line of work for over 10 years. And we're just now starting to make a lot of difference. So for even younger people who have grown up only knowing climate and climate change, and seeing older generations almost, I mean, you all are doing things. I know you all are doing things. But for people on social media, it doesn't really look like it sometimes.
I think it goes back to the framing of, you know, when we see these sometimes apolitical views or the destruction of the Arctic or biodiversity loss, you'll see the comments and people are saying, we are the issue, heartbroken emoji. And it's like, no, we are not the issue. Yes, we all contribute to environmental impact, but corporations and white supremacy is depleting natural resources at such a rapid rate that we are seeing these effects. And I think a lot of people get so easily to be able to say, yeah, we are the virus. And it's like, I really try to defeat that narrative by saying, like, you know, my ancestors were displaced by their own lands and, you know, were forced to migrate in the United States for that reason. And the other thing is just being able to really understand how much what we're currently dealing with in our current politics, where you know, critical race theory is being slammed and being banned in a lot of schools. Like, what makes you think that when it comes to environmental justice, environmental racism right now, in East Palestine, they're blaming the EPA, saying that if they didn't focus on environmental racism, this wouldn't have happened. So, we are losing momentum at the same time gaining it in our own communities. But I do think that there needs to be able to really be stronger communicators in this movement, which is why a lot of young people here are trying to really communicate with you all, like, let us be in those rooms and like, let us really build those relationships, because at the end of the day, there's gonna be a point where you all are not gonna be, able to walk because you get older, and we are the ones that are gonna be in those rooms. And we need to be able to build stronger coalitions, of course, and to really build that wisdom to ensure younger generations are not easily swayed into this doomerist narrative.
Yeah, I think something that's kind of been woven through this whole conversation are these questions of individual versus collective responsibility, right? And I think something that feeds climate doomerism is this feeling of like, what can I as an individual do about this problem? It's so huge. But really, it's not like an individual can't solve the climate crisis. Like, it has to be individuals coming together collectively to make sure that governments and militaries and, big corporations are being held accountable and taking the action they need at the scale that's required. So, yeah, I think, and that's just a more empowering way to think about it, right? Like, it's a group problem. It is not it's not you and your straws or whatever. So, how do you try to reinforce that message on your platforms?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's just about how do we build community? How do we use social media as a tool for community? I think this is the first generation where we can use these tools to be able to mobilize and meet people from around the world, from communities we've never been a part of like that, at a click of a button. I've met people from, countries around the world that are working on climate activism in communities that I would probably never have access to or don't want to, burn all the carbon to get to, all those things. And it's just really exciting because we're sharing and exchanging information at such a rapid rate. We're able to build new tools. And, it's just very exciting what young people can do with social media if they use it strategically and leverage it as a way to mobilize the people around them to take action in their communities. I just think there's never been a better time for people to get involved in this fight, especially young people, because there's so much strategy that can happen. And on an intergenerational note, because I love older folks, I would say that there's a really big opportunity in this room right now where it's if you're, instead of being oh, I'm not on social media, it's no, why don't I treat people like us as experts and actually partner with us, because you have the institutional knowledge, you have access to all these resources in academia and climate science, and we have access to trusted audiences of hundreds to millions of thousands of people around the world. And so it's how can we actually create those intentional partnerships and build together? Because that, I think, is a piece of the puzzle that's missing. It's not a young people versus old people approach. It needs to be intergenerational if we're actually going to save this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, echoing off everything that you've been saying is that, I love having older friends. I was telling my younger friends, that the importance of having older friends is, yes, they have mansions or houses, they're already established, you get to stay, hang out with them, they treat you really well, like a child. But, I think in terms of mentorship, I've been able to really ground myself even more. And I've always said that, we don't think social media is the solution. We've always said it's a part of the solution. I understand as a communicator, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a CEO. I always tell people clearly that, look, I want to be able to respect everyone's work title here. So how do we really build together other than you just seeing me as an influencer that sells products? It's I'm much more worth than that. We all have environmental science degrees, and that's always devalued in these spaces just because, oh, well, you're just a young person. You probably don't know what you're doing. It's a lot of us have actually been in many rooms and conversations with these business leaders. So I think a lot of older people here actually just reach out to young people and see how we can actually knowledge exchange, and also maybe letting me stay at your property for a few days.
Do you want to add anything, Elena?
Listen to young people, listen to other generations, but when it comes to community building, we can't ignore different communities. We must all work together, and for us, our communities are offline, but they are also online. And like Christy said, we have between us, millions of people who follow us, and those are our community. And together, we can all work to make that community billions of people.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know, I feel like it can be a little corny to end these kinds of events with questions about like, what gives you hope about the climate crisis? So instead, like, what do you hope people walk out of the room with today? If they came in here with one idea about climate doomerism, what should they know? Except intergenerational organizing is a good thing.
I would say take climate doom very seriously. It is clearly impacting young people, and that is who we need to get on board with climate action. They are going to be experiencing the worst impacts of it. The older generations, unfortunately, will not be around for that, but we will. And because of that, we need to address climate doom in the way that we communicate, in the way that we publish academic papers, in the way that we go about policy as well.
All right, we're at time. Thank you so much, everyone.